The ring caught the candlelight before it caught my attention, a small flash of rose gold and blue across the table, and for a moment I thought I was imagining things. I wasn't. I set my wine glass down slowly, carefully, the way you set down something you don't trust your own hand with anymore, and I looked again. There it was, on the right hand of a woman half my age, sitting 3 seats down from my husband at his own 45th birthday dinner, laughing at something his business partner had said. My mother's ring. The one I kept in a fireproof safe in my closet, wrapped in the same velvet pouch it had been wrapped in the day the funeral home returned her personal effects to me. The one I had worn exactly 4 times in 3 years, because some things are too precious to risk on an ordinary Tuesday. I didn't gasp. I didn't drop my fork. I smiled, the way you smile at a stranger's joke you didn't quite hear, and I reached for my phone under the table, and I made a call. My name is Vanessa Cole. I'm 41 years old, and I've spent the last 15 years as senior counsel at one of the oldest trusts and estates practices in the city, which means I have built an entire career on a single, unglamorous truth: everything of value eventually has to be accounted for. Every asset, every heirloom, every quiet transfer of ownership leaves a paper trail somewhere, whether the people involved intend it to or not. I know how to read a chain of custody the way other people read a room. I never imagined I'd need that skill at my own husband's birthday dinner, staring across a table at a woman wearing my dead mother's ring like it belonged to her. Julian and I had been married for 11 years. We met the way people used to meet before everything moved onto a screen, at a mutual friend's wedding, both of us standing near the bar because neither of us liked to dance in front of strangers. He was an architect, the kind who talked about buildings the way other men talk about sports, with a real, unguarded enthusiasm that I found disarming in a city full of people performing indifference. He built his firm from a 2-person office above a dry cleaner into a name that got mentioned in magazines. I watched him do it, proud in the particular way you're proud of someone you chose rather than someone you were simply given. We didn't have children, not by circumstance but by decision, a decision we'd made together in our early 30s that I never once regretted and that Julian, at least outwardly, never once seemed to regret either. What we had instead was each other, and for a long time, that felt like more than enough. My mother died 3 years ago, quickly, the way some people are almost merciful enough to go, 6 weeks between the diagnosis and the funeral. She left me very little in material terms: a modest apartment we sold to cover her final expenses, some furniture, a handful of photographs. And the ring. A sapphire set in rose gold, made by a jeweler in Lisbon before I was born, the only piece of real jewelry she'd owned in her entire adult life, purchased with money my grandfather had left her when he passed. She used to tell me the story of that ring the way other families tell stories about houses or land, as though it were the one immovable fact in a family history otherwise full of hardship and improvisation. When she was dying, she took it off her own finger in the hospital and put it in my hand and told me, in a voice already thinner than I wanted to remember, that it wasn't for wearing every day. It was for remembering who you came from on the days you needed reminding. I had it appraised and insured within a month of her funeral, a habit of my profession more than sentiment, though the two aren't always as separate as people assume. The appraisal documented everything: the setting, the stone, a small engraving on the inside of the band, my mother's initials and the year of her wedding, worn nearly smooth from decades against her skin but still legible under a jeweler's loupe. I kept the appraisal paperwork in the same folder as our wills, our deeds, our insurance policies, tucked into the bottom drawer of the file cabinet in my home office, because that is simply what a person in my line of work does with anything irreplaceable. She had asked me to remember who I came from. I hadn't expected that the reminder would arrive at a birthday dinner, in the hand of a woman I had known for 2 years and trusted without a single reservation until the exact moment the candlelight caught the stone and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that my husband had given away the one thing in the world I could never buy back. Her name was Paige Sutherland, and she had been part of the edges of my life since she was in her 20s, first as an intern at Julian's firm, then as his most trusted project coordinator, then, gradually and without my ever quite noticing the transition, as something closer to family. Her mother, Renata, had been my closest friend since law school, The kind of friendship that survives decades and distance and disagreements simply because it was built before either of us had anything to protect. When Renata's marriage ended badly and money was tight, I helped where I could, the way you help people you love, without keeping score. I helped Paige get her first real job, at Julian's firm, because I believed in her and because it felt like something small I could do for Renata's daughter. I watched Paige grow from a nervous 23-year-old who called me Aunt Vanessa into a confident young woman who Julian said had, in his words, real instincts for the business. I was proud of that, too, in the same uncomplicated way I was proud of Julian's success, because I had never once considered that admiration could be the first quiet cousin of something else entirely. Looking back now, with the particular clarity that only arrives after the fact, I can trace 100 small moments that should have told me something. Moments I filed away at the time as nothing, the way you file away a single odd transaction on a client's account before you understand it's part of a pattern. Julian working later at the office than the projects seemed to require. Paige texting him on weekends about things that could easily have waited until Monday. A dinner 2 years ago where I caught Renata watching her own daughter across the table with an expression I couldn't quite place at the time and have thought about constantly since, something between pride and worry. The look of a mother who suspects her child is standing too close to a fire and hasn't decided whether to say something yet. I didn't see it, because I wasn't looking for it, because looking for it would have required believing it was possible, and I had spent 11 years building a marriage on the specific, deliberate assumption that it wasn't. Julian and I had our difficulties, the way any two people who have shared a decade together do. There was a stretch, about 18 months ago, when his firm nearly lost a major client and he became someone I barely recognized for a few months, short-tempered, distracted, gone more than he was home. I gave him room, the way you give someone room when you trust that the distance is temporary and the person coming back to you is still the person who left. I told myself that marriage sometimes looks like patience more than passion, that the quiet stretches are simply the cost of building something that lasts. I believed, the way you believe things you've decided are true rather than things you've actually confirmed, that whatever distance had opened between us during that period had closed again once the business stabilized. I see now that it never closed. It simply moved somewhere I wasn't looking. The dinner itself had been my idea, a private room at the restaurant where Julian and I had our first anniversary, 20 people, close friends and family. The kind of evening I'd spent 2 weeks planning down to the seating chart because I wanted his 45th to feel like something, a marker, the kind of night you remember fondly for years afterward. I had seated Paige near the far end of the table, not out of any suspicion but simply because that's where the younger colleagues from the firm naturally clustered, near Julian's business partner and his wife. I remember feeling pleased with the arrangement earlier that evening, pleased with the flowers, pleased with the wine list, pleased with the entire quiet architecture of a night I had built to honor a man I trusted completely. I remember thinking, as I watched him laugh at the head of the table, surrounded by people who loved him, that this was exactly what 11 years of marriage was supposed to look like. And then the light shifted, and the stone caught it, and every certainty I had walked into that room with quietly, permanently, rearranged itself into something else. The call I made under the table that night was not to Julian, and it was not to Paige, and it was not to anyone at that dinner at all. It was to a woman named Odette Marchetti, a private investigator I had worked with professionally on 3 separate estate disputes over the years, someone I trusted precisely because she had never once, in any of those cases, let emotion move faster than evidence. I kept my voice low, my expression pleasant, my body angled slightly away from the table as though I were simply stepping out to take a work call, the kind of thing everyone at that dinner had seen me do 100 times before without a second thought. I need a full financial and communications history, I told her quietly, on a person and on my husband, going back at least 2 years. I want it done properly. I want it done quietly. And I want it done before I say a single word to either of them. Odette didn't ask why. She never did. She simply asked for the 2 names, and I gave them to her, Julian Voss and Paige Sutherland, in the same even tone I might have used to order dessert. Then I put my phone away, walked back into that private dining room, and sat back down at my husband's 45th birthday dinner, and I smiled, and I stayed for another 2 hours. I want to be honest about what that took, Because I think people imagine composure like mine comes from somewhere cold, and it doesn't. It comes from somewhere very specific and very deliberate, a decision made in real time, sentence by sentence, to postpone the version of myself that wanted to stand up and ask Paige, in front of 20 guests, why she was wearing my mother's ring. I have spent 15 years telling clients that the worst thing you can do, when you discover a hidden asset, a forged signature, a quietly diverted inheritance, is confront the person who did it before you understand the full shape of what they did. Confrontation without evidence gives the other side time to explain, to soften, to reorganize the story before you've even finished reading it. I have watched grieving families lose entire estates because someone reacted a week too early. I was not going to make that mistake in my own home. So I watched Julian blow out his candles. I watched him make a short, warm toast about how grateful he was for the people in that room, a toast that, I now understood, had been written for an audience that included the woman he was betraying me with, sitting close enough to touch. I watched Paige clap along with everyone else, the ring catching the light every time she raised her glass, and some small, deliberately quieted part of me catalogued every detail the way I would catalog evidence in any other case, the exact angle of the stone, the slight looseness of the band on her smaller finger, the way she occasionally touched it with her thumb, unconsciously, the way you touch something new that you're still getting used to wearing. I drove Julian home myself that night because he'd had wine and I hadn't, and in the car he thanked me for the dinner, told me it was one of the best nights he'd had in years, reached over at a red light and squeezed my hand in a gesture so casual, so familiar, so entirely unchanged from 11 years of marriage, that for one strange, disorienting moment I genuinely wondered if I had imagined the entire thing. I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. I have built a career on not imagining things, on trusting documented fact over the much more comfortable alternative of doubting my own perception. But I understood, sitting beside him at that red light with his hand warm over mine, exactly why so many people choose the comfortable alternative anyway. It would have been so much easier to let it go, to decide the light had played a trick on me, to keep the version of my marriage I'd built my whole adult identity around fully intact for one more night. I didn't let it go. I went home, got into bed beside my husband, listened to him fall asleep within minutes the way he always did, untroubled, unguarded, and I lay awake in the dark running the timeline of the last 2 years through my mind the way I'd run 1,000 client files before it, waiting for Odette's first report, and already knowing, with a certainty I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet, exactly what it was going to say. Odette's first report came through 6 days later, a plain email with a password-protected attachment, and I read it alone in my office on a Saturday morning while Julian was at the gym, the same gym he'd started going to 18 months earlier, around the exact time I'd assumed our difficulties had simply been about his business. The report was thorough in the way I had trained myself, over 15 years, to expect and to demand. 11 months of hotel charges under a corporate card registered to Julian's firm, always at the same boutique property 40 minutes outside the city, always booked under a client entertainment code that, when I cross-referenced it against the firm's actual project calendar, corresponded to no client meetings at all. A second phone, not a secret number exactly, simply a work device page had been issued for firm business, its location data placing it at that same hotel on 11 separate weekends over 11 months, always alongside Julian's primary phone, the two devices moving together like a matched pair across a map I had never once thought to look at. I found the emotional cost of that discovery less overwhelming than I expected, and more overwhelming in a different way entirely. There is a particular grief in confirming a betrayal you already suspected, a grief that has less to do with the new information itself and more to do with grieving all the months you spent believing something you now understand was never true. I didn't cry over the hotel receipts. I cried, once, briefly, standing in my closet with my hand on the fireproof safe, over the ring, because that was the piece of the report I hadn't been prepared for, the piece that had nothing to do with romance or betrayal in the ordinary sense and everything to do with a specific, deliberate violation of the one thing I had left of my mother. The safe had a simple mechanical lock, the combination shared only between Julian and myself, unchanged since we'd installed it 4 years earlier. I checked our home security system's entry logs. A feature I'd insisted on installing after a string of break-ins in our neighborhood and had genuinely never expected to use for anything except reassurance. The logs showed the closet door opening on a Tuesday afternoon in March, at 2:14 p.m., a day I knew for certain I had been in trial in another state, a day Julian had told me he was working from home because a client call had been moved. I called the jeweler who had done the original appraisal, a small, meticulous man named Mr. Okonkwo who had handled my mother's ring personally 3 years earlier and remembered the piece the moment I described it, the sapphire, the rose gold, the engraving worn nearly smooth inside the band. I asked him, carefully, whether anyone had brought a ring matching that description in for resizing recently. He checked his records while I waited on the phone, my hand pressed flat against my own kitchen counter, and confirmed that yes, in fact, a ring matching that exact description had come in for resizing 4 months earlier, brought in by a man who'd identified himself as the owner's husband, picking it up as a surprise gift, he'd said, for someone special. Mr. Okonkwo had thought nothing of it. Why would he have? I hung up the phone and sat very still for a long time, longer than I usually allow myself to sit still with anything, because I understood, with a clarity that felt almost violent, that this was no longer simply a story about a marriage. My husband had gone into my closet, opened a safe using a combination we had built together as a symbol of shared trust, taken the single physical object that connected me to my dead mother, and given it to another woman as though it were his to give it all. That detail changed something in me permanently. I had been prepared, in some distant, theoretical way, to eventually forgive an affair, the way people sometimes do, slowly, imperfectly, over years. I understood in that moment that I would never, under any circumstance, forgive the ring. Some betrayals attack a marriage. That one attacked something older and larger than the marriage, something that had nothing to do with Julian at all, and everything to do with a woman in a hospital bed 3 years earlier who had pressed a piece of rose gold into my palm and asked me to remember who I came from. I intended to. I found a family law attorney the following Monday, a sharp, unhurried woman named Priscilla Adeyemi who came recommended by a colleague and who listened to my entire account without interrupting once, taking notes only when I got to the part about the safe and the appraisal records. She told me, in the same measured tone I use with my own clients, that the ring itself could likely be recovered as a separate matter from the divorce entirely, since it had never been a marital asset to begin with, it had been my sole inherited property, and what Julian had done amounted to converting someone else's property without consent, a civil claim distinct from anything about our marriage. That distinction mattered to me more than I expected it to. I didn't want the ring back as a condition of a divorce settlement, something negotiated and haggled over alongside furniture and retirement accounts. I wanted it back as a simple, undeniable matter of law, because it had never belonged to my marriage in the first place. It had belonged to my mother, and then to me, and Julian had never had the right to give it to anyone. We filed the following week, quietly, the paperwork moving through channels that would take time to surface publicly, exactly the way I wanted it to. I didn't confront Julian. I didn't confront Paige. I went home each night and made dinner and asked about his day and listened to him talk about a new project the firm had just won, and I felt something I can only describe as a strange, cold clarity, the sense of standing at a great height and seeing the entire shape of a landscape you'd previously only ever walked through blind. What I hadn't expected, in all of it, was Renata. 2.5 weeks after the dinner, she called me on a Sunday evening, her voice thin in a way I'd rarely heard in 20 years of friendship. "Vanessa," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I think I should have told you a long time ago." I let her talk. I have learned, across 15 years of watching people confess things in conference rooms, that the people who finally decide to tell the truth almost always need to arrive at it in their own order, and interrupting them rarely gets you there faster. She told me she had suspected something was happening between Paige and Julian for nearly a year, had seen the two of them together once, by accident, at a restaurant across town on a weekend. Julian had told me he was traveling for a site visit. She told me she had confronted Paige privately, months earlier, and that Paige had begged her not to say anything, had promised it was ending, had cried in a way that convinced Renata, against her better judgment, to give her daughter room to end it on her own terms rather than detonating two families at once. I asked her, as gently as I could manage, why she'd never once considered that the person most entitled to that information was me. She was quiet for a long moment. "Because I told myself I was protecting you," she said finally, "and I think some part of me knew even as I was saying it that I was really protecting her, and that isn't the same thing, and I've known it wasn't the same thing for months, and I let myself keep believing it anyway because the alternative meant losing my own daughter's trust to save yours." I want to be honest about what I felt hearing that, because it wasn't the fury I might have predicted years earlier. It was something closer to a specific, exhausted sadness, the particular grief of understanding that a friendship you'd built an entire adult life around had, in its final act, chosen someone else's comfort over your right to the truth. I told Renata I appreciated her honesty, 3 weeks too late as it was, and I told her I needed time before I could decide what our friendship would look like going forward, if it would look like anything at all. She didn't argue. I think some part of her had been expecting exactly that answer for a long time, had perhaps even been relieved when it finally arrived, the way you're relieved when a verdict comes down after months of simply not knowing. I hung up the phone and sat with it, the way I'd learned to sit with difficult information rather than reacting to it immediately, and I understood that the dinner, the ring, the 11 months documented in Odette's report, had never been a single betrayal at all. It had been 3 separate people, each making their own quiet decision, over months and sometimes years, to let me keep believing something none of them believed themselves. Julian was served on a Thursday afternoon, at his office, in front of colleagues, not because I wanted the spectacle of it but because Priscilla had advised that serving him at home would give him time to prepare a version of events before we ever spoke directly, and I had learned, across 15 years of watching people protect themselves, exactly how much can change in the space between a discovery and a conversation. He called me 4 times within the hour. I let all 4 calls go to voicemail, the way I would have advised any client to do, and I finished the brief I was working on, and I drove home at my usual time, and I was standing in our kitchen when he came through the door still in his work clothes, his face doing something I had genuinely never seen it do in 11 years of marriage. "You're divorcing me," he said, not quite a question, the papers still folded in his hand like something he couldn't decide whether to hold on to or set down. "I want the ring back first," I said. I hadn't planned to open with that. I'd planned, in the version of this conversation I'd rehearsed in my head a dozen times over 3 weeks, to let him talk first, to let him explain himself the way people always want to explain themselves, but standing there in my own kitchen, looking at the man who had opened my closet safe on a Tuesday afternoon in March, I found I genuinely didn't care what explanation he'd prepared. "I want the ring back, and then we can talk about everything else." He set the papers down slowly on the counter. "How long have you known?" he asked, and I told him, plainly, without embellishment, exactly what I knew and how I'd come to know it: the dinner, the candlelight, the resizing records, the entry log on the closet door, the 11 months in Odette's report. I watched something in his face give way as I spoke, not surprise exactly, more like the specific exhaustion of a person who has spent months maintaining a story only to discover it was never as secure as he'd convinced himself it was. "Vanessa," he said finally, "it wasn't supposed to become what it became. It started small. I was under so much pressure with the firm, and Paige was just there, and it felt easier than talking to you about how badly I was struggling." I didn't say anything for a moment, letting the silence do what silence often does better than a question, drawing more out of a person than an interruption ever could. "It felt easier than talking to me," I repeated back to him, "and then I felt entitled to give her my dead mother's ring instead." He flinched at that, visibly, the way a person flinches when a fact they've been quietly minimizing for months is finally stated back to them in its full, unadorned shape. "I never meant for that to be part of it," he said. "It happened after we'd already been seeing each other for a while. I saw it in the safe one weekend when I was looking for the passports, and I don't know, I convinced myself it was just sitting there, that you barely wore it, that it wasn't really being used for anything." That justification landed on me the way a single, small fact sometimes lands harder than an entire narrative, because I understood, hearing it, that he hadn't given away my mother's ring in some blind, passionate moment of not thinking clearly. He had opened a safe, looked at an object he knew meant more to me than almost anything else I owned, and made a calculated decision that its absence was a risk worth taking. That wasn't a man swept up in an affair. That was a man who had quietly, deliberately decided, at some specific moment I would never fully know the shape of, that my grief was an asset he was entitled to spend. He tried, for a while, to make the conversation about the marriage instead of the ring, the way people often do when they'd rather discuss the larger, vaguer wound than the specific, undeniable one. He talked about feeling invisible after the firm's difficult year, about how I'd become, in his words, more married to my clients than to him during that stretch, about a distance he said had opened between us that he didn't know how to name at the time and still struggled to name now. I let him talk, because I have learned that people rarely reveal the full shape of their reasoning until you let them exhaust it completely, and because some part of me, even then, wanted to understand whether there had been a real wound underneath the betrayal or simply an excuse constructed after the fact to make the betrayal survivable in his own mind. When he finished, I asked him a single question. If you felt invisible, I said, why was your solution to become someone I couldn't recognize instead of someone who finally told me the truth? He didn't have an answer for that, not really, and I watched him understand, in real time, that the story he'd been quietly building for months, the one where circumstances had slowly, understandably pushed him toward Paige, didn't actually hold up once it was said out loud in my kitchen instead of rehearsed silently in his own head. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me, he said finally. I know what I did. I know it doesn't have an excuse that fixes anything. I appreciated that, more than I expected to, the fact that he didn't try to argue his way back into innocence once the full weight of it was in front of him. But appreciation and forgiveness aren't the same transaction, and I told him so. I think in time I'll stop being angry, I said. Anger isn't something I want to carry around for years, it isn't useful to me, and I've never been a person who enjoys carrying things that don't serve a purpose. But not being angry anymore isn't the same as choosing to stay, Julian, and I need you to understand that those are two entirely separate outcomes. He asked, quietly, almost as an afterthought, what would happen to Paige. That's not my responsibility to sort out, I told him, and I meant it. Whatever she and Renata have to work through between themselves, whatever she and you decide about a future together once the dust settles, none of that requires my participation anymore. I found, saying it out loud, that it was entirely true, that somewhere between the dinner and Odette's report and Renata's phone call, I had genuinely stopped needing an accounting of what happened to Paige at all. She had made her choices with full knowledge of what they cost, and I no longer had any interest in auditing the rest of her life for her. Julian asked, near the end, in a voice smaller than I'd heard from him in a decade, whether there was any version of this where we found our way back to each other eventually, given time, given distance, given whatever a person imagines might repair something this specific. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel by that point in the conversation, not rage, not even the particular grief I'd carried for 3 weeks, but a kind of quiet, settled finality, the way you feel closing the final page of a case file you already know the outcome of. There isn't, I told him. Not because I can't eventually forgive you. I think, given enough time, I probably will, because carrying this forever isn't a version of my life I'm interested in living. But forgiveness was never going to be the same thing as staying, and I need the ring back by Friday. The ring came back on a Friday afternoon, exactly as I'd asked, delivered not by Julian but by a courier arranged through Priscilla's office, in a small padded box with a single line typed on the accompanying letter confirming it was returned voluntarily and without dispute as to ownership. I sat at my kitchen table and opened it alone, the same table where I'd spent that first night piecing together 3 years of my marriage from credit card statements and cloud photo albums, and I turned the ring over in my hand, checking, out of habit more than doubt, for the engraving inside the band, my mother's initials, worn nearly smooth, still exactly where they'd always been. I had it reappraised the following week, not because I doubted its authenticity but because I wanted a fresh, complete record, a clean start to its documentation that had nothing to do with the 11 months it had spent somewhere I never authorized it to go. Mr. Okonkwo examined it carefully, the way he always did, and told me, gently, that it showed no damage, that whoever had worn it had, at least, taken reasonable care of it. I told him I appreciated him telling me that, and I meant it, though I noticed, sitting in his small shop with the ring finally back in my own hand, that the relief I felt had very little to do with the ring's condition and everything to do with simply having it home. The divorce moved through mediation over the following 2 months, and Priscilla had been right that the ring's return, handled as a separate matter, kept it entirely out of the settlement negotiations, which made everything else move faster and cleaner than I think either Julian or his own attorney expected. I asked for what I was legally entitled to and nothing more, no punitive terms, no attempt to extract additional cost from him through the financial split, because the truth of what he'd done had already cost him more, in the accounting that mattered most to me, than any settlement figure could. I heard, secondhand, through a colleague who still worked with Julian's firm, that Paige had left the company within weeks of the divorce filing becoming public knowledge among their circle, unwilling, apparently, to remain in an office where everyone now understood exactly what those 11 months of Thursday hotel bookings had actually been. I heard she'd moved to another city entirely. Julian didn't go with her. I don't know the full story of why, and for the first time in this entire account, I found I genuinely didn't need to know it, the way you stop needing to know the ending of a book you've already decided to close. Renata called twice more over those 2 months. I answered the second time, briefly, and told her honestly that I didn't yet know what our friendship would look like, that 20 years didn't disappear because of one decision, however costly, but that I also wasn't ready to pretend the decision hadn't happened. She said she understood, and I believed her, and I told her I'd call when I was ready to talk further, and I meant that too. The final mediation session took place on a Tuesday morning, deliberately unremarkable in every way I could arrange, no dramatic final confrontation, no last attempt at reconciliation across a conference table, simply 2 attorneys finalizing paperwork while Julian and I sat at opposite ends of a table saying almost nothing to each other at all. When it was over, I walked out of that building into ordinary daylight, the ring back on my own hand for the first time in months, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel quite that clearly, a kind of complete, settled ownership over my own life that I hadn't fully possessed, I realized, in longer than I wanted to admit, even before that Tuesday afternoon in March when a lock I trusted opened for someone else. I didn't rebuild my life around what I'd lost that year. I built it, deliberately, around what the entire experience had taught me about the specific difference between trust and evidence, a distinction I'd spent my career applying to other people's families without ever once turning it fully on my own. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I used part of the settlement, along with some savings I'd kept separate for exactly this kind of decision, to start a small consulting practice alongside my existing work, one focused specifically on helping clients protect inherited property, heirlooms, family jewelry, the kind of possessions that carry meaning far beyond their appraised value, from exactly the sort of quiet erosion mine had nearly suffered. I named it nothing sentimental, nothing that referenced my own story directly, because I'd learned something else that year too, that the most useful things you build rarely need your own history attached to them in order to matter to the people they end up helping. I still practice estate law full-time. I still spend my days reading files, finding the small inconsistency that someone hoped no one would notice, the transaction that doesn't quite belong, the story that almost makes sense until you look closely enough. I've simply learned to apply that same attention closer to home than I ever thought I'd need to. I wear my mother's ring more often now, not because the fear of losing it again has faded exactly, but because I decided, somewhere in the months after it came back to me, that keeping something precious locked away out of fear defeats the entire purpose of having it at all. She told me, in that hospital room 3 years ago, that the ring wasn't for wearing every day, that it was for the days I needed reminding of who I came from. I understand now that she may have meant something slightly different by that than I originally assumed. I don't think she meant I should save the reminder for rare, careful occasions. I think she meant that some days simply arrive when you need reminding more urgently than others, and you don't always get to choose in advance which days those will be. The day the ring came back to me, sitting alone at my kitchen table with the box finally open in my hands, was exactly that kind of day, and I wore it the following morning without a second thought, the way she would have wanted me to. Renata and I speak occasionally now, carefully, the way you speak to someone you've decided is still worth the effort of rebuilding something with, even after the effort has become considerably harder than it used to be. I don't know if we'll ever return to what we were before that Sunday phone call. I've stopped expecting relationships to return fully to what they were before a fracture. I've learned instead to ask whether something new, smaller perhaps, more honest certainly, is worth building in its place, and with Renata, I've decided that it is. I think about the 11 years of my marriage often, not with the bitterness I might have predicted for myself a year ago, but with a specific, hard-won gratitude for the clarity the entire experience eventually gave me. I spent a long time believing that patience and loyalty were simply things you gave freely, without needing to verify what you were receiving in return. I understand now that love without evidence isn't trust at all. It's simply hope wearing trust's clothing, and hope, unlike trust, asks nothing of the person receiving it. I no longer confuse the two, in my marriage that ended or in anything I build going forward. I spent 38 years assuming that being careful meant being suspicious, and that being loving meant refusing to look too closely. I know now that the two were never actually in conflict at all. My closest friend outside of Renata, a woman named Josephine who I'd known since law school and who had no connection at all to Julian's world, sat with me the week after the divorce was finalized and asked me the one question nobody else had thought to ask. Not what happened, not how I found out, not what I planned to do next, but simply whether I was actually, privately, allowed to be angry about the ring specifically, separate from everything else, without that anger seeming disproportionate to people who hadn't understood what the object meant. I told her yes, immediately, without needing to think about it, because I had already spent months quietly worrying that grieving an object, however meaningful, might look excessive next to grieving an 11-year marriage. Josephine shook her head at that. She told me the ring was never really about an object at all, that Julian and Paige and even Renata had each, in their own way, decided that something precious to me was theirs to spend without asking, and that the specific form it took, a ring instead of money or time or attention, didn't make the violation smaller, it simply made it easier to see clearly, the way a single, sharp detail sometimes reveals a pattern that a dozen vaguer wrongs had been quietly building toward for months. I've thought about that conversation often since. I think she was right. The ring wasn't the whole betrayal. It was simply the one piece of it, small enough, specific enough, undeniable enough, to finally force me to look directly at everything else I had spent 18 months carefully not examining. I asked Josephine directly whether she thought I'd handled the whole thing correctly, the quiet investigation, the courier instead of a confrontation, the 2 hours smiling at that dinner table with the evidence already forming in my mind. She told me there wasn't a correct way to survive something like that, only versions that let you live with yourself afterward and versions that don't, and that from where she was sitting, I looked like a woman who could still meet her own eyes in a mirror without flinching, which was more than she could say for a lot of people she'd watched go through far less. I've held on to that assessment more than almost anything else anyone said to me that year, because it was never really about Julian, or Paige, or even the ring itself in the end. It was about whether I could still recognize the person looking back at me once all of it was over. People sometimes ask me, when they hear a shortened version of this story secondhand, why I didn't confront Paige directly, that night at the dinner or in the weeks that followed, why I let the ring sit on her finger for the rest of that evening instead of saying something the moment I recognized it. I understand the question. There's a version of this story that would have felt more satisfying told a different way, a dramatic scene in a crowded restaurant, a public reckoning in front of 20 guests, the kind of moment that feels, in the imagining of it, like justice arriving exactly on schedule. I've thought about that version many times since, and I've concluded, every time, that it would have cost me more than it ever would have cost either of them. A scene at that dinner would have given Julian and Paige a story to tell afterward, one where I lost my composure in public over an object, where the conversation became about my reaction instead of their choices. It would have let them cast me, even briefly, as the person who created a disruption rather than the person who discovered one. I have watched that exact dynamic play out in other people's family disputes more times than I can count, watched the person who reacted visibly become, in the retelling, somehow more responsible for the discomfort of the room than the person whose actions had actually caused it. I wasn't going to hand either of them that story. I chose, instead, the version of justice that took longer and asked more of me, the version built on documentation instead of drama, on a private investigator's report instead of a scene, on a courier delivering a small padded box instead of a confrontation across a dinner table. I think, if I'm honest, that this is the part of the story people find hardest to fully believe, the idea that I sat through 2 more hours of that dinner, smiling, making conversation, watching my mother's ring catch candlelight every time Paige raised her glass, and felt something closer to control than to grief. But I did. I've spent 15 years building a professional life around the specific discipline of not reacting to the first piece of information you receive, of gathering everything before you ever let anyone know what you already suspect, and that discipline, it turns out, doesn't switch off simply because the file in question happens to be your own marriage. If anything, I think it's the only reason I got through that dinner at all. There's something almost meditative about focusing on the mechanics of a problem instead of the emotional weight of it, at least temporarily, at least long enough to get yourself safely out of a room before you let yourself fully feel whatever is waiting on the other side of that door. I felt all of it eventually, in my car afterward, alone in my closet holding the empty space where the ring should have been, at 2 a.m. reading Odette's first report with my hands not quite steady. I simply refused to feel it in front of the 2 people who had caused it, because I understood, even in that first disorienting moment at the table, that composure was the one thing neither of them could take from me if I didn't hand it over voluntarily. I think about Julian sometimes, not often, but occasionally, usually when I catch sight of a building his firm designed somewhere across the city, a small, involuntary reminder of 11 years I don't regret having lived even though I regret entirely how they ended. I don't wish him harm. I've found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I don't spend much energy wishing him anything at all anymore, which I think is its own quiet kind of resolution, the absence of a wish either way. I hope Paige eventually builds whatever life she was chasing when she decided an 11-month secret was worth the eventual cost of it. I hope Renata and I find our way to something honest and lasting between us, even if it looks different from what we had before. And I hope, whenever the next difficult season of my life arrives, because I've learned enough by now to know that it eventually will, that I remember exactly what this one taught me, that patience is only a virtue when it's paired with attention, that love without verification is simply a story you're telling yourself, and that the quietest response to betrayal is very often the one that lasts the longest, precisely because it never needed anyone else's audience to feel complete. If you've stayed with me through all of this, I'd love to know what you think happens for Vanessa next. Do you think she lets someone new earn that same trust again someday, slowly, on her own careful terms? Or do you think she's found something in this chapter of her life that feels whole enough entirely on its own? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and what you would have done in that dining room the moment the candlelight caught that ring. I read every single one of them. If this story found you at the right moment, stay close, because there are so many more like it waiting, and I'd love for you to be here when the next one arrives.